The precision filter found one vague word in one law, replaced it with a metric, closed the exploit surface. That is the tool at its smallest scale. Now the same question at a different scale. Not one word. An entire architecture. Not one law. Thousands of them. The DSI's second tool. The complexity ceiling. Every rule in the regulatory code was written for a reason. A workplace safety standard exists because workers were injured. A disclosure requirement exists because investors were defrauded. A licensing requirement exists because unlicensed practitioners caused harm. Each rule, traced back to its origin, has a defensible purpose. That is the strongest case for regulatory complexity as it currently exists. Because there was no design to it, it accumulated. Every addition was a response to a real problem. Every new requirement addressed something the prior rules did not cover. The system grew because the problems it was responding to were real. And in the highest stakes domains, constitutional rights, criminal law, maximum precision is not optional. No ceiling applies there. The architecture has always known the difference. That case deserves to be stated before the tools run. A system cannot be capped before it is measured. That is the first job, not setting the limit, mapping what exists. The DSI's third function, the flow architecture audit, runs before the complexity ceiling is applied. It maps the regulatory architecture in a given domain. Every rule, every provision, every cross-reference. And it asks, for each one, does this rule still do what it was written to do? Is it redundant, covered by another rule that came after it? Is it obsolete, written for a condition that no longer exists? Does it overlap with a neighboring provision in ways that create compliance conflicts rather than compliance clarity? What the audit identifies is system noise, not complexity that serves a function. Bulk that accumulates because no one was assigned to remove it. Superseded rules that stayed on the books. Overlapping provisions that cover the same ground twice. Regulations written for industries that no longer exist in the form they governed. System noise does not protect anyone. It does not close any exploit surface. It burdens every case that has to navigate around it while serving none of them. The flow architecture audit clears it, consolidates what overlaps, removes what is obsolete, merges what covers the same ground. What remains after the audit is a baseline, the actual functional complexity of the domain, stripped of the accumulated bulk. Only then does the complexity ceiling apply, because a limit applied to an unmeasured system is not a limit. It is a guess with a number attached. A note on terminology. This tool was introduced in Video 5 as the complexity budget. That name created a problem. Budget implies financial allocation, a question of what gets funded and what does not. That is the wrong model entirely. The correct model is a constitutional hard limit on total regulatory complexity. A ceiling, a load limit the system is not permitted to exceed. The name has been corrected. The function is the same. The complexity ceiling asks one question the current system never asks. What is the aggregate cost of this rule to the cases it was not written for? A rule written for 1% of cases is still a rule every other case must navigate. The compliance burden does not stay inside the edge case. It distributes across the entire system. The person filing a straightforward tax return does not have a straightforward tax return. They have thousands of pages of code, the vast majority of which exists for transactions they will never conduct, written with a precision that serves specialists and burdens everyone else. The United States tax code is the demonstration. After the flow architecture audit runs, after the system noise is identified and cleared, what remains is the functional complexity. The complexity ceiling applies to that number, not to the bloated total, to the actual load the system needs to carry. The exploit surface is the gap between those two numbers, and in a system that has never run the audit, that gap is large. The complexity ceiling has a second question. Who benefits when navigation requires a specialist? Complexity is not neutral. A system that requires expert interpretation to navigate concentrates access in the hands of people who can afford the expert. The tax attorney, the regulatory consultant, the compliance department. These are not luxuries for large organizations. They are table stakes. For individuals and small operations, they are barriers. The Earned Income Tax Credit illustrates the mechanism precisely. A benefit designed specifically for lower-income working families, rendered inaccessible, not by eligibility requirements, but by compliance burden. According to IRS estimates, approximately 1 in 5 eligible filers does not claim it. Not because they do not qualify, because the form is complex enough, the rules specific enough, and the risk of error consequential enough that a meaningful share of the people the credit was written to help walk away from it. That is not a failure of individual effort. That is a system producing a predictable outcome from a structural condition. The DSI has a name for this. When complexity functions as a structural barrier that concentrates access among the sophisticated and excludes the rest, that is complexity capture. Some of the complexity enabling it is functional. Some of it is system noise. The flow architecture audit separates the two. The complexity ceiling governs what remains. Together, they remove the structural condition that complexity capture depends on. The complexity ceiling does not propose deregulation. That distinction is architectural, not cosmetic. Deregulation is a value judgment about which rules should exist. The complexity ceiling is a system constraint on how many rules can exist simultaneously. It does not decide what stays. It requires that the total does not grow without a corresponding reduction. The mechanism is the 2 out 1 in rule. Before a new rule of measurable complexity enters the regulatory code, 2 rules of equivalent or greater complexity must be removed. The new rule must earn its place. The rules it displaces must be identified before it is adopted. The net complexity of the system does not increase. This is entropy management. Every complex system accumulates rules over time. Rules written for conditions that no longer exist. Rules superseded by later rules, but never removed. Rules that addressed a real problem decades ago and have not been reviewed since. The 2 out 1 in rule does not eliminate these rules by political judgment. It creates a pressure toward elimination that the current system has no mechanism to generate. The DSI maintains the complexity score. Every rule carries a complexity rating, a measure of the navigation burden it places on a standard case. The score is public. The ceiling is constitutional. The trading mechanism is mandatory, not a preference, a constraint. A regulatory code operating under the complexity ceiling looks different from the current one in one specific way. Every rule present has survived a cost question the current system never asks. Does the precision this rule provides to the cases it was written for justify the navigation burden it places on all the other cases? Rules that pass that test stay. Rules that fail it are candidates for removal under the 2 out 1 in mechanism. Rules that serve 1% of cases at significant cost to the other 99 are flagged. The people who benefit from those rules can argue for their retention. The argument must be made publicly against a documented complexity cost before a body that has no financial interest in the outcome. That is not a smaller government. That is a legible one. A government a standard citizen can navigate without a specialist interpreter standing between them and the rules that govern their life. The complexity ceiling does not have a political position on which rules should exist. It has a structural position on how many rules can accumulate without measurement. A progressive who wants strong environmental regulation and a conservative who wants reduced compliance burden for small businesses are arguing about different things. The complexity ceiling does not resolve that argument. It creates the conditions under which that argument produces a legible outcome, one where the complexity cost of every rule is visible, the ceiling is enforced, and the trade-off between precision and accessibility is made explicitly rather than accumulated invisibly. The current system does not have that argument. It has accumulation. Every interest adds. Nothing requires removal. The total grows. The navigation cost rises. And the people least equipped to pay that cost pay the most of it, not because anyone decided that was acceptable, but because no one was assigned to measure it. The DSI is assigned to measure it. The flow architecture audit clears the baseline. The complexity ceiling governs what enters from that point forward. Together, they do what the current system has no architecture to do. Require that complexity justify its cost before it enters the code, and require that it be removed when it cannot. The flow architecture audit and the complexity ceiling are not the same tool. They close different problems in a specific order. The audit is retrospective. It addresses what already exists and should not. The ceiling is prospective. It governs what enters from this point forward. The audit runs first because the ceiling needs a clean baseline to measure from. Every 10 years, The Constitution requires both to run in sequence. The governing body identifies the 20% of rules causing 80% of system noise, rewrites or removes them, publishes a diff report, every deletion documented, every consolidation on record, then resets the ceiling. This is system defragmentation, not a political act, a scheduled maintenance cycle, built into the architecture the way a reset mechanism is built into any system designed to last. A limit applied to an unmeasured system is not a limit. It is a guess with a number attached. Map the system, clear the noise, set the ceiling. I am the system architect. Next, the public exploit ledger, the DSI's transparency tool. How every finding, the precision filter, and the complexity ceiling produce becomes permanent, public, and on the record, with no mechanism for removing it once it is there.